Tim Schafer's latest game, Brutal Legend, rocks, but does it have what it takes to really crash the stage? Sorry, I didn't really have a joke for the opening, so there you go. Metal witticisms aside, Brutal Legend combines RTS, racing, and open-world exploration into one big, heavy metal fondue pot of crazy. And what does it come out with? Let's take a look. I don't really have a transition for this, so... Oh look, a penny! The tale of Brutal Legend begins with Eddie Riggs, who ends up being transported to an ancient land ruled by metal gods after blood ends up dripping onto his, might I say, bitchin' belt buckle. Now, Tim Schafer's strong point has always been his writing, and he doesn't disappoint here. While the tale centers around a farcical romp through a fantastical music world, it surprisingly has an eloquence about it by the time you reach the end. Though you'll get the feeling you're hearing the same conversation over and over and over again by some NPCs, you'll find yourself engrossed in the story in Brutal Legend. A lot of the story succeeds largely in part to the animations and character design. The designs of the characters straddle the line between comical and realistic, which aids in getting the player through a storyline that jumps its track towards a more dramatic direction later on. Eddie, Lita, Lars, and love interest Ophelia all behave with strong facials and a level of exuberance usually exhibited by giddy kids at the first rock show. It's strong characters like this that make a mediocre story into a heartfelt one. Luckily for Brutal Legend, the story's already fantastic. On the other side of the spectrum, mad props gotta be given out to the voice actors and the soundtrack guys. Most people know this as that game Jack Black does voice work for, but they'd be forgetting Jennifer Hale, Lita Ford, Lemmy. These are all people who provide some keynote performances as Eddie Riggs' cohorts. The rest of the voice cast is rounded out by, get this, Ozzy Osbourne, Brian Posehn, and the always pitch-perfect Tim Curry. Tim Curry voices the main bad guy, Diviculus, and it is just fantastic. There's not one performance that sounds phoned in. Of course, you can't have a metal rock opera game without a kick-ass soundtrack, and the game is literally overflowing with face melters. I had finished the story mode, and I still hadn't heard the complete soundtrack. You can unlock songs as you progress through the other elements of the game. The gameplay is a mixed bag of exploratory elements, racing and car sequences, and some difficult-to-control real-time strategy battles. Double Fine really seemed to have bit off more than they could chew with the decision to include all these genres, and sadly, they just don't deliver in spades like the rest of the game. Each part of the gameplay trifecta is polished only to a certain degree. The open-world exploration segments are beautifully rendered, showing character and passion, but the lack of a real drive to go out and discover things really hampers the section. The racing parts, while short and sweet, are nicely guided experiences that break up the dull portions of the game, but the sluggish controls for just about every vehicle don't help much in the fun factor department. Finally, the RTS sequences are just tedious, shallow, and difficult to control. Sadly, these RTS sequences make up most of the story gameplay as well. You can sprout wings and survey the field during battle, but you have to be close to your troops to command them. Selecting and declaring orders can be a chore if there's more than one conflict on the battlefield. And the lack of a heads-up display during battle can make you spend precious seconds trying to remember what the bare-bones tutorial spent less time than needed teaching you. The gameplay never hinders what would otherwise be an enjoyable experience, but after completing the campaign mode, I was hard-pressed to go back and nab collectibles and other completion items because, well, the gameplay just wasn't that fun to me. What hurts the sections after the story is the lack of Schafer's quick-witted writing. There's no pot of hilarity at the end of the no-fun rainbow. Unless you want to spend a few more hours completing the same 3 secondary missions, I wouldn't recommend revisiting the single player. There's also a not quite filling, but not quite robust multiplayer element that uses the RTS elements from the single player. Here you're offered a bit more variety in that you can choose to command Eddie Riggs, Diviculus, or the Army of the Drowning Doom. The downside here is that you've been using Eddie for the single player, and when there's no tutorial for the other 2 armies, you're more than likely going to stick with what you know. I didn't experience lag or any slip-ups online, but I found the RTS elements to be ho-hum and mediocre, just like they were in single player. Some other small things annoyed me about the game, such as a more than noticeable amount of frames dropped during the action. Even when I installed the game to my hard drive, there were still some frame rate drops. There seems to be a little bit more time left over at the end of cutscenes too, leaving the characters standing around awkwardly waiting for the scene to finish. And finally, the draw distance just does not allow you to see every single oncoming enemy, so you couldn't always organize your attacks efficiently. It gets frustrating when you think you have everything figured out, but because the game couldn't render something far in the distance, you're now looking at a surprise attack. At the end of the day, Brutal Legend isn't a bad game. It's just not a great one. It's not enough of an RTS, it's not enough of a racing game, and it's not enough of an open-world exploration game to really make it into one cohesive whole experience. It's still good, just not great. Brutal Legend gets a 7 out of 10.